we found an artist in England who had produced this painting for a book called Petersburg, The Longest Siege, which came out recently. And between him and his publisher, Odyssey Publications, also an English company, we received this poster. It's the best representation that we have. It's the closest, I think, that depicts the action. Anyhow, we hope, we want to thank the members of the General Robert E. Lee Camp, number 1589 in Midlothian, for obtaining the flag, for doing the work to secure the nomination and authorization of the Sons of Confederate Veterans Medal of Honor, and also for this depiction. At this time, I'd like to ask our Sons of Confederate Veterans Commander-in-Chief, Michael Givens, to come forward. He's going to talk about this soldier and his actions. I'd also like to ask Joyce Rash of the Ladies Memorial Association, Vice President, to step forward with us, and also Martha Mann Atkinson, Site Manager of the Blandford Church, past President of the Ladies Memorial Association, to come forward with us, please. Ladies.
I want to tell you all a little bit about this man. The Medal of Honor, you know, we give this very rarely. And this man, I think you will agree, deserves it. But, you know, we're gathered here today to honor and remember the service of President Jefferson Davis, our only President of the Confederate States of America. It is well and proper that we also honor the memory of while we honor the memory of our Supreme Leader who guided us through this terrible war, that we also remember the courage and the sacrifice of the lowly private soldier who bore the pain and suffering of the battles to defend our country against a vile invader. One such soldier was Private Lawrence Berry. Private Berry was only 18 years old when he left home in New Orleans, Louisiana, and traveled to Mobile, Alabama, to enlist in the 3rd Company Battalion, Washington Artillery of Louisiana on March 13, 1863. He listed his employment as being a barber. 4 months later, he would be hospitalized for sickness, as were many of the young men unaccustomed to sleeping out in the open, poor diet, and unclean water. 3 months after being placed in the hospital, he returned to his company and fought with them at Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Kingsland Creek, Drewry's Bluff, and finally Petersburg, Virginia. He was hospitalized again in Richmond for a gunshot wound that was believed that he received at Chancellorsville, and again returned to his company. In June of 1864, he was placed on detached service with the right lines of the defense of Petersburg, Virginia. By the end of March 1865, things looked bad for the Confederacy as Union troops were steadily building a massive force to break the lines at Petersburg and then make their move to the capital city of Richmond. By the 1st of April, General Lee knew that the thin lines of Petersburg could not hold. What few troops had been manning the works around Petersburg needed to be evacuated, and the Army moved to safety. Only a handful of our troops were left on the defensive lines with the orders to hold their positions at all costs. Their defensive works were known as Fort Gregg, but for later generations it was also known as the Confederate Alamo. 334 Confederate defenders were left to buy precious time for General Lee to evacuate and save his army. Every minute that these few men could hold the fort was precious time to General Lee. As the 4,400 Federals began their attack of Fort Gregg, General Nathaniel H. Harris yelled to the defenders of the fort above the roar of cannon, "Men, the salvation of the Army is in your keep. Don't surrender this fort." With that last order, General Harris evacuated. 3 separate waves of Federals attacked the little fort, and each wave was repulsed. The final assault resulted in the Federals swarming over the parapets, and bloody hand-to-hand fighting continued. The results were 55 of the defenders were killed in action, and 125 were wounded. Of 8 cannon that were defending the fort, 7 were out of commission. With the gun crews killed or wounded, only the 6-pounder of Private Berry remained operable, and he had loaded it with double canister. As the last wave of Federals swarmed over the parapet, they shouted to Private Berry, "Don't fire that gun! Drop the lanyard or we'll shoot." To this, Private Berry replied, "Shoot and be damned." He pulled the firing lanyard. The blast from his gun took down many of the invading Federals, but Private Berry was immediately shot down with many bullets piercing his body. Private Berry lies buried in an unmarked mass grave, along with his brave comrades in the Blandford Cemetery in Petersburg. It is interesting to note that the federal government awarded 14 Medals of Honor to the Federal soldiers who fought at the Battle of Fort Gregg against its tiny handful of Confederate defenders. As Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, it is my honor and it is my privilege to honor the Confederate Medal of Honor to Private Lawrence Berry of the 3rd Company Battalion, Washington Artillery of Louisiana, for his bravery and self-sacrifice demonstrated on the 2nd of April, 1865 at the Battle of Fort Gregg, Petersburg. Thank you very much.
The award will be on display at the Blandford Museum Reception Center. Hopefully there'll be room for the poster as well. But these ladies are receiving it on behalf of that museum, and we thank them for doing that. Thank you so much.
Thank you all very much. We're very pleased to be receiving this display. Obviously, Lawrence Berry was quite a hero for the Washington Artillery. In addition to those men being buried within the cemetery, we also have a beautiful window in our chapel dedicated to the Washington Artillery of Louisiana. So there's several reasons to come and visit Blandford Church and Cemetery. Thank you so much.
I'm now recite a poem that I saw in the one of the last issues of the Sons of Confederate Veterans magazine by a compatriot, Buddy Rowan. A Confederate soldier. He laid down his axe, picked up his gun to stop the invaders in blue from Washington. He had never been very far from his farm, never wanted to do any man harm. He was issued a uniform, musket and 40 rounds. He woke up in a tent to drum rolls and bugle sounds. They marched him and drilled him, then marched him some more to make him strong for the hardships he would endure. He boarded the train for part of his guest, then formed up the road and put on his brogans to the test. After several hours marching, he heard musket fire ahead. We quickened our pace when we saw our wounded and dead. We formed our battle line just below the creek's banks as the Yankees drove our boys back through our ranks. We opened fire when they came over that rise. Their line faltered, then stopped in confusion and surprise. We countercharged with fixed bayonets and a rebel shout. In a very short time, their white flag was put out. We rounded up prisoners, we buried our dead. My first trial on fire, I pushed straight ahead. We'll now hear from trumpeter Charles Terry as he plays Bonnie Blue Flag. Thank you, Charles. I've just been told by our chairman that we have 325 people in attendance today. Thank you all very much for coming. I know y'all didn't want to be here yesterday about this time when the microburst came through here. Lots of things were carried away. Our keynote speaker today, y'all have already seen come up here to the podium several times, and you're going to hear a good talk today as he talks about Robbie Lee, his relationship with Davis, and just what embodies people like them. Robert Michael Givens was born in Anderson, South Carolina on March 19, 1958. He grew up in the rolling hills of Pickens, South Carolina, and the golf course town of Pascagoula, Mississippi. Attended college at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee, and the Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, California. He graduated there with a BA in professional photography and cinematography. He joined the Sons of Confederate Veterans in 1994 after seeing a billboard in Arkansas. He then rechartered the General Richard H. Anderson Camp No. 47 in Beaufort with Commander Brian Kennedy. And the camp still meets in the historic arsenal there where the camp was originally chartered in 1897. To highlight his achievements, he's been commander of that camp, commander of the 5th Brigade, South Carolina Division, lieutenant commander of South Carolina Division, commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, lieutenant commander-in-chief, and presently the commander-in-chief, director of international development for 2 years, and numerous national committees. The awards he's won has been Jefferson Davis Chalice, Robbie Lee Award, Commander-in-Chief's Award, Meritorious Service several times, Distinguished Service multiple times, and the Stonewall Jackson and Dixie Club Awards. He has reformatted the Confederate Veteran Magazine and created the Vision Program to strengthen and grow the SCV in the coming 5 years. He set up a genealogical DNA research program for the SCV through Family Tree DNA as a service for our membership and as a fundraiser for the SCV. He created the Immediate Action Committee, which enables fast and effective response to heritage violations. He built the South Carolina Division to over 3,200 members and 69 camps and increased the coffers to over $100,000. He's persuaded the state of South Carolina to grant proceeds from a special license plate which nets the SCV more than $18,000 a year. He faced down a U.S. Congress when liberal groups attempted to build a national park dedicated to reconstruction. He produced 2 fundraising documentaries for the SCV, The Hundley Experience and the Southern Heritage Celebration in 2000. Created a speakers list for the South Carolina Division, which is over 60 pages long. And he edited a journal of Southern history entitled Richard H. Anderson Review, helped organize the historic flag rally in Columbia, South Carolina in January 2000, and has held numerous speaking engagements all over the United States, including the Stephen D. Lee Institute. He's the great-great-grandson of Private Peter Harrison Givens, Company H. Carter's 1st Tennessee Cavalry, and he presently lives in Pickens with his wife, Nicole, and his 2 children, Chandler and Olivia, and he's a lifetime member of the SCV. Also attends First Presbyterian Church in Beaufort. So, without further ado, please welcome the Commander-in-Chief of the Sons of Confederate Veterans, Robert Michael Givens.
Y'all want the abridged, or you want to hear the whole thing? Okay. Good, because I don't have an abridged version. It's in your favor. You know, you can tell a lot about a man by the people that he surrounds himself with. What an honor it is to be here. What an honor it is to be with people like you and to be at the graveside of one of our greatest heroes. I hope I don't lose my memory as I grow old and I remember this moment, because I think it's a great honor for all of us to be here and to remember these people. When you know about these people, I said it the other night, I think I know too much. And I'm going to tell you some stuff today that maybe makes it too much. But this is why we revere these people. Samuel Johnson, who wrote a dictionary, once said, "Any man honored by both his enemies and his compatriots is a man worthy of our closest attentions, for in him you may be sure to find authenticity. For after all, authenticity is the rarest of all human traits." Today, I want to talk about a man that was very closely associated with Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis made him the General-in-Chief of his armies, General Robert Edward Lee. General Robert Edward Lee was a master of war, and at the same time, he was a servant of the Lord. Some people say that those two things don't exactly go together, but they certainly do. I know many of you have been to St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Richmond. If you go inside St. Paul's Episcopal Church, you'll see two stained glass windows dedicated to Robert E. Lee. One of them depicts Moses taking the children of Israel into the Promised Land. And the story comes from Hebrews 11 through 26, and the word of the Lord reads as follows. It says, "By faith Moses, when he had come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ as greater riches than the treasures in Egypt." What did that mean? Well, folks, in ancient Egypt, the throne didn't pass from the Pharaoh or the king to the eldest son. It passed to the son of the eldest daughter of Pharaoh's favorite wife. And if you can follow that, that was Moses. Moses was sort of the Prince of Wales. He was about 40 years old at the time, and he had spent his whole life being primed and prepared for that top slot. He had studied every sort of science and mathematics and history and literature of the time, and was about as a learned man as you could possibly find. But Moses turned his back on all the wealth and the power and the pleasure that would have gone with that monarchy because he found something better. The writers of Hebrews tells us the true story when he says that Moses chose to follow Christ, knowing that any pain that he might suffer would be well worth the sacrifice. Well, folks, Robert Edward Lee made a similar choice. When Abraham Lincoln decided that he needed to subdue the South, and the only way he could do it was with the might of his army, he went to Winfield Scott. And Winfield Scott, when he was asked to send troops into the South to subjugate these people, said, basically, you really can't do that. Your Constitution doesn't allow it. And to be honest, Winfield Scott was getting a little aged, and he wasn't looking forward to a war. And so Lincoln says, well, who can I get? And Winfield Scott, who knew Robert E. Lee as well as anybody, suggested Colonel Lee. He said, Colonel Lee is the only person I believe that people would follow into this. So Lincoln sends Francis Blair to go talk to Robert E. Lee. If y'all saw that movie, Guys and Generals, it's the beginning of the movie. He sits with Francis Blair and he offers him. Now you got to understand at this point, Robert E. Lee, who was a colonel, had spent his entire adult life in the United States Army. He had been, just like Moses, being prepared for the top slot all the way along. He had rarely been outside of our country. He'd been to Mexico, but he had studied the world and he had studied military tactics, and he knew it better than anybody. And he was offered the top slot. They offered him the command of all of the United States forces. Winfield Scott described him at one point as the greatest military genius in America. Robert E. Lee went to his home. Now, I know many of y'all have also been to Arlington. Just yesterday, I was visiting with Mr. Abdul over at the White House of the Confederacy. And he talked about this, and I've experienced the same thing. If you go to Arlington and you go to that second floor and you go look at that bedroom on the second floor, on the night of April the 19th, 1861, Robert E. Lee left his meeting with Francis Blair and he went home. And he had to make a very, very heavy decision. What does he do? He wasn't under orders at the time. If he was to entertain the idea of leaving the army, he could not leave while under orders because he was too much of a man of duty. So he stood in his room all night, pacing back and forth, thinking, what should I do? What should I do? From time to time, his wife, who was downstairs, would hear his footsteps, and periodically they would stop. During these times, he would be dropping to his knees to pray to the Lord, to ask advice. How do I handle this? At one point, he sent a note down to his wife, and he said, I fear it is out of the power of man, and in God alone must be our trust. God is our refuge and our strength, let us humble ourselves before him. Unless it be Washington, George Washington, there's no military chieftain of the past whom Lee can be justly compared in either the attributes of character or in the good that he made on the age in which he lived. Those who knew him best and studied him most have agreed that he was unlike any of the other captains in history. In his entire public career, there was a singular absence of self-seeking. Otherwise, he would have listened to those wooings of ambition when debating the course that he should take at the beginning of this bloody sectional conflict. He knew that he could hold any position that he wished in the armies of the Union, but he also knew, for he declared more than once, that the South's chances for success, except with foreign intervention, were far from encouraging. So I ask you to ponder on your own education. What do you think Alexander, what do you think Caesar, what do you think Napoleon would have done in the same circumstance? With the prospect of leading armies with overwhelming numbers and backed by limited resources, any one of these great captains of history would have eagerly grasped at the power that was offered. But it was not so with Robert E. Lee. Trained soldier as he was, at that moment, he was standing on a mountaintop of temptation and would not be moved. He turned his back on ambition, putting selfish considerations behind him, just like George Washington in the old Revolution, and threw himself and all his interest into an unequal struggle for separate government. At St. John's Church downtown, y'all know that's where Patrick Henry stood up and gave that impassioned speech that ended with, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, folks, he was standing on precisely the same moral ground that Robert E. Lee stood on from the beginning to the end of the war. So Robert E. Lee refused that command. His duty was to his people. He said that if Virginia was to leave, he could never draw his sword against his people. And you know what else he said? A lot of people don't know this. He said that he would resign and he would become a private citizen. And if he was required in the Confederacy, then he would join as a private in the cavalry. Can y'all imagine Robert Edward Lee as a private? I cannot. I cannot. But it didn't go that way. He was attending church, and he was met by some men who took him right over to Richmond, and they had a chat with him and swore him in as the commander of the Virginia forces. At that point, Jefferson Davis basically put him in a position of counsel. He wasn't in the field. He didn't have a field command, which is what he wanted. But at the beginning of the war, you got to understand, the Confederacy was severely wanting in arms. You realize that the Ordnance Department called on citizens to give up their souvenir pistols and any muskets that might be hanging over the fireplace that their granddaddies or their daddies used in the Revolution, so that the soldiers might have weapons. And Robert E. Lee, in his position, working for President Davis, approved a remarkable order to supply General Jackson with 1,000 pikes, which are crude spears, medieval spears, because the army was so short on supplies. Our men started out basically with pitchforks and spears. But all that would change as well. In June of 1862, General Johnston was camped near Richmond, and they were fighting in the battle that we call 7 Pines. Now, Robert E. Lee used to be good about sending letters out to his commanders out in the field, just so that he could stay in contact, know what was going on, and just because he wanted to feel closer to the action. Well, he sent a letter to Joe Johnston, and he allowed that he wanted to come and visit, and I'm going to paraphrase it, but basically, Joe Johnston sent back, "Yeah, I'd be happy to see you, just don't bother me." And so, a few days later, Johnston is in his tent, and his aide-de-camp comes in and says, "Sir, President Davis and General Lee are headed over here, and they're about to come in." Well, that freaked him out, and he headed out to the front lines, and he took a couple of bullets in his hide, and they brought him back, and after a little bit of discussion, I mean, Beauregard was one of the names that was mentioned, but basically, Jefferson Davis put Robert E. Lee as the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. And folks, let me tell you something. There was nothing more that scared the North than that right there. One Northern correspondent wrote, "The shell which wounded General Johnston, although it confused the rebels, was the saddest shot fired during the war. It changed the entire rebel tactics. It took away incompetence, indecision, and dissatisfaction and gave skillful generalmanship, excellent plans, and good discipline. Before the Battle of Fair Oaks," that's what they called Seven Pines, "the rebel troops were sickly, half-fed and clothed, and had no hearts for their work. After Lee took command, the discipline became better. They went into battle with shouts, without being urged, and when in, they fought like tigers." Lee's view of war was different than many. It was shaped by his consciousness of God's justice and man's sin. Lee wrote to his wife in February of 1862, he said, "I hope that God will at last crown our efforts with success, but the contest must be long and severe. The whole country must go through much suffering. It is necessary that we must be humble and taught to be less boastful, less selfish, and more devoted to right and justice to all the world." Besides building an army of warriors, Robert E. Lee took great interest in the revival of the men of the Army of Northern Virginia. He attended as many church services as humanly possible and made orders not to set duties except where it's unavoidable that would restrict the soldiers from attending as well. At the end of November 1863, the Army was camped in a place called Mine Run. It's fairly close to here. A battle was expected to happen at any moment, and Lee and a number of his staff were riding down the line of battle when they came upon a party of soldiers who were down on their knees engaged in prayer. At this time, some of the skirmishers are already starting to fire, and cannons are trying to get their range. But when Robert E. Lee saw these men on their knees, he dismounted, he uncovered his head, and he joined the men in prayer. The rest of his staff followed in his example. Now, can you imagine what those privates thought when they looked up from prayer and saw their great chieftain on his knees with them, praying as that battle began? That is one of the reasons why the men followed him so closely and why they loved him so much. During the winter months of 1864 and 1865, when General Lee and his 30,000 remaining men were holding the line against General Grant's overwhelming numbers, the soldiers and the officers under his command built 60 chapels. It was reported that sometimes a person could stand in one place and hear 2 or 3 different religious ceremonies going on at the same time, and legend has it that Robert E. Lee was in every one of them. He was a servant of the Lord. But he was also a master of war. Jefferson Davis said, "If we lose this war, the North would rewrite history in its favor." Today, virtually all Southern schools teach our children from books that were published in the North by Northern authors. A nation that is ignorant of its past is a nation that is ripe for deception and manipulation. Therefore, it's not the truth, but what people believe to be the truth that determines the direction of a nation. At the outset of the war, Bishop William Wilner asked Robert E. Lee, he said, "How do you expect to achieve success in such an unequal contest?" Robert E. Lee answered him and said, "At present, I am not concerned with results. My reliance is in God. God's will ought to be our aim, and I am contented that His designs be accomplished and not my own." I want to put the war in a little bit of perspective to you. We're in a war right now. Y'all hear about it every day. Let's think about some of the earlier wars. The War for American Independence involved about 250,000 men that went out and fought. Of those 250,000 men, about 10,000 of them perished. That was about 4% of the men that left home to go fight. The War for Southern Independence, the North sent south 2.2 million men to invade your homes. Of those men, Now, these numbers seem to be going up every day, but the numbers that we study from some of the early guys like Fox, they tell you that 360,000 of those fellows died. That's about 17% of the Yankees that left home. But the South defended herself with just about 800,000 men. And of those, about 260,000 or more died. And folks, that's 33%. There was not a home, there was not a family, there was not a human being in the South that was not touched by this war. And people today want you and me to forget it. People today want us to agree with a bunch of idiots that the Confederate battle flag is a racist symbol. It is not. That is the symbol of those men who left their homes and fought and struggled for a free nation, and 33% of them died. So let's look at something of today. From the time, what was it, March 19th, was it 2003 or 4, that George Bush said that we were going to go into Iraq. Until today, we have lost 4,486 Americans in Iraq. In Afghanistan, we've lost 1,995. Now, I got to tell you, for me, that's too many. I hate that. But imagine our Confederate ancestors. They saw numbers like that every day. Every day. How many years have we been in Iraq? And I don't belittle one single loss that we had over there. God bless them, and God bless their families. But imagine, do y'all remember the day? Do you remember the day when you picked up your newspaper and in big bold print it said 1,000 dead in Iraq? Every day. Every day. But even with these huge numbers, even with these huge losses, Robert E. Lee won most of the battles that he led. Lee had an uncanny ability to analyze the battle situations. He'd take into account the men, the materiel on both sides, the geographical situation, the morale, the weather conditions, the disposition of the relative forces. He would then be able to arrive at the correct judgment of what the opponent was likely to do. And then he would know what to plan and how to devise to prevent the enemy from taking advantage. He was unbelievable. Let me give you a few battles and a few numbers, which may be a little bit dry, but it's a little bit frightening. The 7 Days Battle was June 1862. Robert E. Lee's fighting a man named McClellan. McClellan has 100,000 men encroaching this town we're in right now. Robert E. Lee had about 50,000 men, plus about 18,000 threadbare men of Jackson, but yet they still pushed back McClellan. McClellan, yesterday in my tour with Abdul, he described McClellan as being the best soldier in the Confederate Army. He was not wrong. Second Manassas was August 30th, 1862. Now Robert E. Lee is fighting a man named Pope. Pope has 75,000 troops, and Robert E. Lee is defending his ground with 48,000. He sends 20,000 of Stonewall Jackson's men around to the right flank, and Pope's put down. There's a lot of men on the field. Under the leadership of Robert E. Lee, in 4 short months, the 80,000 men total of the Army of Northern Virginia had met and driven 200,000 veteran troops of Banks, Fremont, McDowell, McClellan, and Pope far from within the bounds of Virginia into disastrous retreat to beyond its borders. But the war rages on. Antietam, what we like to say Sharpsburg, September 1862. He's now fighting McClellan again. McClellan's got 87,000 men. Robert E. Lee has 40,000. Friends, this is the bloodiest day in American history. Remember what I told you about what we lost in Iraq? 4,486 to this day in all these years. In one day, the United States troops lost 12,400 men. Robert E. Lee lost 10,700 in one day. Now, losing all these men hurt Robert E. Lee. He didn't want to lose any of his men. He loved all of his men as if they were his own sons. Now he had sons, as you know, And he didn't lose his sons. I'll tell you a story. There was a time that Robert E. Lee was riding along the lines of a battle, and it was a heavy, hot battle. I don't remember which one it was. But he noticed an artillery unit coming up toward him and coming back from the front, and it had some youngsters there with it, and one of them came up to his horse, and his face was blackened. And he looked up at the general and he said, "Sir, don't you recognize me?" And he looked down closely at him and realized it was his son Robert. And he said, "Yes, son, I do." And then he said, "Sir, would you have us go back to the front lines?" And this is where I differ from Robert E. Lee, because he was able to look at his son and say, "Yes, go back to the front lines." I have a son that's 17 years old. I don't know if I could do that. But he sent his son back after his son had already been in the heat of battle. Robert E. Lee never lost any of his sons, but he certainly suffered some family tragedy. His wife and children had to be moved from Arlington because it was captured immediately, and they had moved on down into North Carolina. And at one point, Robert E. Lee was in his tent. He was preparing for a battle, and his adjutant, Walter Taylor, comes in and tells him that it was either him or it was a messenger that brought him a note that said that his daughter, Annie, had taken sick. Now, Robert E. Lee was planning a battle, so of course he couldn't leave. He couldn't leave Virginia and go to North Carolina and be with his family and help out. So he went back to work. A little bit later, another messenger came in to bring him the news that she had indeed passed. It was October the 20th, 1862. And at that point, Walter Taylor decided to give him some space, and he left his tent and to give him some room to think about it. And while he was there alone, he wrote a letter to his wife, and in part he said, "I cannot express the anguish I feel at the death of our sweet Annie. To know that I shall never see her again on earth, that her place in our circle, which I always hope one day to enjoy, is forever vacant, is agonizing in the extreme. But God in this, as in all things, has mingled mercy with the blow in selecting that one best prepared to leave us. May you be able to join me in saying, His will be done." When Walter Taylor came back into the tent, he saw for the first and only time his great chieftain and our hero with his face in his hands, weeping. But he couldn't leave. He had a war to run. Fredericksburg, November 1862. Robert E. Lee is now fighting a man named Burnside, who has 114,000 men to Robert E. Lee's 72,000. In that battle, Burnside loses 13,000 men, and Robert E. Lee loses 5,300. Then comes Chancellorsville, May 1863. He's fighting a man named Hooker. Hooker has 134,000 men on the field, and Robert E. Lee 61,000. Hooker loses 17,000 men, and Robert E. Lee lost 13,000. Robert E. Lee again split the army and sent Jackson around to flank, and once again won the day. But the Confederacy lost its most aggressive defender from that battle, Stonewall Jackson. After the battle, Robert E. Lee did something that was unusual. He didn't do this very often, but he gave a congratulatory speech to the men of the Army of Northern Virginia. And in part, he said this. He said, "While this glorious victory entitles you to the praises and gratitude of the nation, we are especially called upon to return our grateful thanks to the only one, the only giver of victory for the single deliverance He wrought. It is therefore earnestly recommended that the troops unite on Sunday next in ascribing unto the Lord of hosts the glory due upon His name." Now, folks, Sunday next was May the 10th. May the 10th was the day Stonewall Jackson succumbed from his wounds, and it was the day that he had asked all of the Army of Northern Virginia to praise the Lord. So while his army was praising the Lord was taking Stonewall Jackson from us. Gettysburg. I'm telling you these battles for a reason, and these numbers are very important. July 1863. Now, these folks met by chance. I like to think, from my readings, that the idea of Gettysburg, at least in theory, was developed by Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee together. But this particular battle, they met by chance. Robert E. Lee was against Meade. Meade had 94,000 men. Robert E. Lee had 72,000. Meade lost, in the 3 days of Gettysburg, 23,055 men. Robert E. Lee lost 23,231. Sounds like a draw. It was not. It was not. But they lost together about as many men as we lost in all 7 years in Vietnam. In 3 days. Can you imagine reading your newspapers in 1863? That loss was sobering for both sides. Both sides. After Gettysburg, a Christian revival grew within the ranks of the Confederacy. 15,000 men professed being born again shortly after Gettysburg. According to historian Charles Jennings, the A&V revival resulted in the conversion of over 50,000 souls. Most people don't realize that the Bible Belt was created in this war. Our Christian and religious heritage was strengthened and really created from the suffering of our ancestors. But the revival of all these men in the Army of Northern Virginia made General Lee happier than any victory that he ever won in the field. One of his biographers wrote that one almost feels as if he cared more about winning souls than battles, and for supplying his army with Bibles than with bullets. Well, they used to say that Grant was going to continue sending generals toward Robert E. Lee until he found one that Robert E. Lee didn't understand. Well, eventually he sent him Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Robert E. Lee understood Grant, and he understood him perfectly well. He knew him for a very long time. Well, when Grant came across the Rappahannock, and there was a series of battles zigzagging around the environs of Richmond trying to take the city, there were many, many battles. There's one in particular I'd like you to think about. Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor was 1864, and Ulysses S. Grant was there with 108,000 men, and Robert E. Lee had 62,000. Well, Grant lost 13,000 men, and Lee lost 2,500. But here's what's important. Grant lost 7,200 men in the first half hour. The first half hour. He lost as many men in 20 minutes as we lost in all those years in Iraq. Do y'all understand the power of that? Do y'all understand how horrible that is? Do y'all understand what your ancestors at home had to deal with, much less those men on the front lines? Cold Harbor held the fastest killing rate of the war. During that battle, boys in front wearing blue jackets were seen taking them off, putting notes on their backs so people know where to send their bodies. Grant threw his men into the battle, expecting to win just by sheer numbers. He got the nickname Butcher Grant from this tactic. There's not a single general that served under that man right there that had the name Butcher. But since the crossing of the Rappahannock until the surrender at Appomattox, Grant lost on average 2,000 men a day. 2,000 men a day, folks. A day. Just from his army. Grant suffered incredible losses. He lost nearly 18,000 in the wilderness, another 18,000 in Spotsylvania. In less than a month, the Army of the Potomac lost more men than Robert E. Lee had his entire army at the beginning of the campaign. But Robert E. Lee didn't have enough men to offset his victories. He never had enough men to follow up. Every time he'd fall back, he would have to retire and regroup. He couldn't push forward because he didn't have any more men. But Grant's strategy was to take the advantage of his superior power in men and supplies and to bring pressure to bear on the South at every point, not just on the battlefield. Grant knew that the South could not defend itself over an extended front, pressed consistently for an extended period of time. Part of his overall plan was total war. Total war is when they don't wage war simply on the soldiers, but also on the civilians at home. The purpose of that was to demoralize the Southern troops and the people in the South, Grant knew that he didn't have to win any battles at all. All he had to do was just injure the Confederate troops while distracting them with outrageous acts committed on their people at home. Grant could afford to lose men, Robert E. Lee could not. Grant would batter the Southern troops and the people into submission. Sheridan said when he was sent by Grant into the Shenandoah Valley that a crow would have to bring his own provisions because there would be nothing left to eat. In August of 1864, Sherman declares, now hear me on this, women and children must be made to feel the war just like the man in the field. Can you all imagine if General Petraeus said that in Iraq? He's a great general, a great American. Could you imagine if one of our great modern generals said, the women and the children of Baghdad must be made to feel the war just like the men in the field? And they want us to forget. No, absolutely not. Thousands of Southerners died due to deliberate shelling of civilian targets, the blockade, and the burning of civilian homes. Starvation became widespread because of destruction of food supplies and the implements to make food. Sherman destroyed homes, churches, schools, and entire communities. Y'all ever hear the story of the Roswell women? This is a horrible story. It may be the worst. When Sherman was headed toward Atlanta, he sent parts of his troops out in tendrils to find out if there were any Confederate soldiers anywhere around. They found one little town called New Manchester, where they destroyed everything and everybody, and you will not find that city on a map today. It doesn't exist. But when they came to Roswell, Georgia, they found a factory. And in that factory, they were making cloth. And he said this cloth is probably being used to supply the Confederate soldier. And of the 400 to 500 black and white women that were working side by side in that factory, I want them all arrested. Every one of those women were arrested. They were able to get their children, and they were held like cattle in a pen downtown for just about a week with drunken guards watching over them. At the end of that week, he said, we're taking them up north. And he didn't have enough buckboards to put these women on, so he told the cavalrymen that they would have to take these women on their horses, and some of these men would fight over which women would ride on their horse. Can you imagine the horror? The horror. They took these women to Nashville, Tennessee, where they put them on cattle cars. If you're visualizing this as I tell you, and if you see something that looks like something on its way to Auschwitz, you would be right. These women and their children were sent to St. Louis and beyond. They were then advertised in newspapers as indentured servants, and they were sold virtually into slavery. How many do you suppose got to go home? By the accounts that I've read, there's been one woman whose husband went north and was able to find her out of the 400 to 500 women. One. They didn't teach you that one in school, did they? Mary Chestnut said that Sherman was a nightmare, a ghoul, and a hyena. A Yankee officer who served under Sherman once wrote, "We were about as mean as mob that ever walked the face of the earth. And it's perfectly frightful. If I lived in this country, I would never lay down my arms while a Yankee remained on the soil. I do not blame Southerners for being secessionists now. I could relate many things that would be laughable if they weren't so horribly disgraceful." I think I know too much, folks. That's why I spend so much of my time studying this and trying to teach other people what really happened. The destruction of the South and her people, folks, was devastating. The people. Lee was more than touched by the hand of total war. Robert E. Lee lost nearly all of his personal possessions. Arlington and most of the contents, including the items once belonging to George Washington, were confiscated by the federal government. The White House, which was another family farm, was burnt to the ground by Union soldiers, and the third family farm, Roman Coke, was situated in an area so ravaged by war that there was not even a fence post standing for 8 miles around. Robert E. Lee was nearly bankrupt. Let's contrast that to Robert E. Lee's orders to the Army of Northern Virginia when he crossed into their territory. On June 21st, 1863, he gave General Orders Number 72 to tell his men exactly what they could do and what they could not do, and demanded that they remain civilized. He also wrote what became known as the Chambersburg Order on the 27th of June, 1863, which he sent to his officers. And in part it said this: "It must be remembered that we make war only upon armed men. We cannot take vengeance for the wrongs our people have suffered without lowering ourselves in the eyes of all whose abhorrence has been excited by the atrocities of the enemy, without offending against him to whom vengeance belongeth, without whose favor and support our efforts must all prove in vain." General John Gordon wrote after the war, he said, "Even in his triumphant entry into the territory of the enemy, so regardful was he of civilized warfare, that the observance of his general order as to the private property and private rights left the line of his march marked and marred by no devastated fields, charred ruins, or desolated homes." You know, he lost all those men in Gettysburg. But it's been said that Gettysburg, on one account, was actually a success for Robert E. Lee, because he went into the Northern Territory for two reasons. One, to let them feel the effects of war as our people had felt it for so long, but also to find food. Because what the Yankees had done to the Southern people, there was absolutely no food to feed the troops in the South. There wasn't a blade of grass to put down the neck of one of his mules, much less some food to give to his men. But when he came back, he had a wagon train over 50 miles long of food. But I'll tell you another story. There's a place called, I believe it was Greencastle, Pennsylvania, where on the 4th of July, 1863, after the battle was over, it had rained heavily, the roads were rutted and muddy, and the wounded needed to be taken out and gotten back to Virginia so that they could get some help. They had these buckboards, which are just flat, carriages to be pulled by horses, and they put these poor souls on these things, and they took them out. It was very painful. But as they went through Greencastle, Pennsylvania, a group of men came out and axed the wheels of the buckboards as they slammed down into further agony. Well, there was a cavalry escort, and they went back and rounded up about 50 of the perpetrators, and they took them on down here to Virginia for talking to them. But that's the sort of welcome that our people had to suffer. Barbarism reigned unrestrained. Richard Weaver, who was a 20th century writer and Southern philosopher, observed that it was not so much the loss of property that embittered the South, but the moral affront to the tradition of Christendom that made the insult outlive the injury. Total war so infuriated Robert E. Lee, he later remarked that no civilized nation within my knowledge has ever carried on wars as the United States government has against us. This manner of war was indefensible. Lee did not have enough troops to throw in the way of Grant's overwhelming forces, and at the same time protect the innocent women and children at home. So Richmond fell. Lee's men, while still ready and willing to fight, were literally starving to death. And Robert E. Lee walked into and out of that house in Appomattox Courthouse. All of his men that watched it happen knew exactly what was going on. And many of them stood with tears streaming down their face and calling to Mars Roberts, saying, "We can carry our muskets one more time." But in the end, Robert E. Lee exclaimed, while he would rather die 1,000 deaths than surrender, he had weighed the options, and he thought of the destruction of more of the men in the Army of Northern Virginia, and he sighed, and he said, "It is our duty to live. What would become of the women and children of the South if we were not here to protect them?" So he surrendered. But folks, in spite of all the odds against Robert E. Lee and his grand army, his accomplishments were truly remarkable. He mobilized Virginia and made it ready for war and defendable. He saved the capital from what looked like certain capture just as he took command in 1862. He repulsed 4 major offenses against Richmond and delayed a 5th by taking the war into Pennsylvania. He fought 10 major battles, winning 6 without any dispute, and only once at Gettysburg, suffering a definite defeat. In an interview after the war with General Pendleton, he said, Robert E. Lee said, "I have never believed we could, against the gigantic combination of our subjugation, make good in the long run our independence unless federal powers should directly or indirectly assist us. He went on to say, but such consideration made with me no difference. We had, I was satisfied, sacred principles to maintain and rights to defend, for which we were duty-bound to do our best, even if we perished in the endeavor. From a letter to Robert E. Lee from the great English historian Lord Acton on November the 4th, 1866, he wrote, I saw in states' rights the only availing check on the absolutism of the sovereign will, and secession filled me with hope, not as to the destruction of democracy, but as to the redemption of democracy. Therefore, I deemed you were fighting the battles of our liberty, our progress, our civilization, and I mourn for the state that was lost at Richmond more deeply than I rejoice over that what was saved at Waterloo. There's many things that were said and written about Robert E. Lee, and I'm sure they'll continue on. But one of the most stirring things that I've ever read, I'd like to read to you now, because it came from a wounded soldier, a Yankee soldier, on the field at Gettysburg. Perhaps you've heard it, but you should hear it again, where he said, I had been a most bitter anti-South man, fought and cursed the Confederates desperately. I could see nothing good in any of them. The last day of the fight, I was badly wounded as a ball had shattered my left leg. I lay on the ground not far from Cemetery Ridge, and as General Lee ordered his retreat, he and his officers rode near me. As they came along, I recognized him, and though faint from exposure and loss of blood, I raised my hands and looked at Lee in the face and shouted as loud as I could, Hurrah for the Union! Hurrah for the Union! The general heard me. He stopped his horse, he dismounted, and he came toward me. And I confess, at first I thought he was meant to kill me. But as he came up, he looked down at me with such a sad expression on his face that all fear left me. And I wondered what he was about. He extended his hand to me, grasping mine firmly and looking right into my eyes, and said, My son, I hope you will be well soon. If I live 1,000 years, I shall never forget the expression on General Lee's face. There he was, defeated, retiring from a field that has cost him and his cause almost their last hope. And yet, he stopped to say words like these to a wounded soldier of the opposition who had taunted him as he passed by. As soon as the general left, I laid there and cried myself to sleep on that bloody ground. The author James C. Young wrote, Alexander believed in himself, Caesar in his legions, Napoleon in his destiny, and Lee in his God. Such were the deeds of Robert Edward Lee, and in him we certainly do find authenticity. God save the South. Thank you.